there's a whole other discussion around what's the right approach. Is it one model for all? Is it one model for ATO, one model for scams?
Well, let's
But
get into it. What do you think?
Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast. Dan Holmes here, fraud strategy for FraudBytes, based out of the UK. I'm joined by
Lenny Gusel, on behalf of FeedSci here in the United States.
one of the things that, as you know, is quite unique about the UK is that we have a very solid reporting structure through virtue of a trade body called UK Finance. They centralise the fraud losses every 6 months. They gather the data from the bank, they anonymise it, they aggregate it, and they put it out. So it really gives us a unique macro level view of what's driving challenge within the industry. And the most recent iteration of that, covering the data from 2023, has just been released. One of the things that I found interesting in there, and I'm curious as to whether this is an observation you have in the US, is that telephone banking losses, so payments that are made through virtue of an IVR or through a call center agent. Firstly, I'm not even sure if they're a thing in the US, and I welcome your thoughts on that. But the losses have been decreasing year on year for the last 5 years. This most recent year, we saw a really big jump. And I'm kind of curious as to your thoughts on call center fraud. What are your thoughts around what might be driving that? Is that a problem you expect to see, and so on? So maybe if I flip that one to you to get us going.
That report is so unique. I don't know anywhere in the world that has those kinds of metrics. So it's fascinating and instructive and insightful. That really jumped out at me. So first of all, no, we have no such thing as being able to call in a retail banking context. We don't have no such thing in the United States for regular kind of consumers to be able to call into a call center and make a payment. That exists in wealth management, higher net worth segments where you're talking to a human being. But how you have it instrumented in the UK, where that's an actual channel for payment making, we do not have. However, it does not surprise me that the fraud rates on that channel spiked up. And something that I know others have been watching carefully, both in the US and globally. And it just makes sense. If I'm a bad guy, I'm going to go take advantage of all of the legacy authentication, identity verification, better or worse, using the best that I have available for deep fake voice, for example, using and just taking advantage of the fact that I can call in any number of times, and that I'm thinking from a U.S. context, not many banks have yet done the challenging work of streaming the events from the call center into a common kind of risk engine that's also looking at the rest of the digital channel activity. I know those who have started to do that in the back end and looking at those precursor events and looking at that activity have seen significant value and lift across every type of fraud typology. But I am not at all surprised that the fraudsters, whether it's for payments or for the kind of precursor setup activity, are taking full advantage of a channel that has not gotten the same kind of technology investment or process or policy investment or end-to-end fraud lifecycle investments in the same way as mobile and web, but is intricately linked to consumers being able to do anything. So it jumped out at me, and I think it's a big problem.
Yeah, I think you touched a couple of good points, and the sense of facilitation or point of compromise in that channel is a really interesting one as well. It's not just that the volume of losses via telephony payments directly have increased. There's been a jump in other fraud types, such as card ID theft, which is essentially an account takeover where I use the call center channel to request a new card. I'm able to intercept that card, and then I spend on the card. So the telephony channel acting as a facilitation layer to then subsequently exit funds on another channel is also an issue. Getting all that data in the same risk engine as your other channels is obviously imperative to being able to stitch the customer profile together and drive the best outcomes. Not only to add that point of compromise context to subsequent exits, but just around normalizing what good payments look like, who a customer's paid before, etc., across all of the different touch points. I think another. Go ahead.
Dan, I'm gonna interject. 'Cause I have a burning question on this topic, and wondering in particular, given how far out the UK is with all things scams, authorized payments, APP, as you guys coined it. Um, in the context of the call center channel, I know globally everyone is struggling with the getting as accurate as possible to decline payments on the web channel, and then seeing significant spike in call center activity immediately thereafter, with people either whether they're the wrongdoer themselves, acting on behalf of the customer, or the customer being coached, uh, having all of the knowledge exactly for how to call in, where to call, and how to try to get that transaction released. Not to mention the massive spike in all kinds of nefarious activity in the kind of the case and dispute process as well. Uh, if we stay on this theme of kind of the what's happening in those call centers as such a core part of the life cycle of any customer experience and journey, and such a core part of what we'd like to be monitoring. I'm wondering, in the context of scams and APP, what is that looking like in the UK? Again, we see operational expense and significant amount of call volume and case volume spiking here in the United States. So I'm imagining it's been something that you guys have been really dealing with for a number of years now.
The UK's been through a really interesting journey when it comes to how to authenticate a customer post transaction generally.
Mm.
So if you rewind a few years before scams was the primary threat within the market, actually a lot of the authentication intent and authentication strategy was to move towards a self-serve model. So the idea was that we could reduce the reliance on having high volumes of bums on seats in the call center, and empower the customer to self-serve wherever possible. So an example of what I mean by self-serve could be you try and execute a transaction on web. It's referred because of fraud checks, but if you've got a trusted mobile device where the mobile app is enrolled, you can use a push notification to approve that, and you can do that very quickly without having to speak to anybody. The challenge that scams then presents is that the question you fundamentally have to answer when you're authenticating somebody is very, very different. No longer can you ask the question, was it you that did this? You have to uncover the intent of why the user is doing that. So if you try and apply those same authentication approaches of saying, here's a push notification, Lenny, can you confirm this was you? In the context of a scam, of course, as the victim, you're going to say, yes, it was me. So we've actually seen that reversed, and now we've gone back to a strategy of getting more bums on seats in the call center. And the most appropriate and most effective strategy is to have a human-to-human contact where the human in the call center can try and unpack the intent of the transaction with the human that's potentially being a victim. And they can have a very sensible conversation around, how were you approached to make this transaction? Why are you making this transaction? Are you doing this because somebody has asked you to do that? And that's the best thing that we're seeing as an attempt to try and break the spell between the fraudster and the victim. Now, it's not perfect and it's not bulletproof. I would say that different banks are at different stages of maturity with that, in terms of that level of understanding and the type of conversation that you need to have. And it's actually a highly desirable skill. It's not something that you can train somebody to do quickly. You've got to have an understanding of the fraud. You've got to have human empathy. You've got to have good conversational skills in order to go and have that right conversation. But it's a very, very interesting kind of journey that we've been through, almost a 180-degree spin in terms of how we're serving those authentication needs.
I'm very keen to. So it's the same things here, and that issue of intent, and the very specialized kind of break the spell kinds of teams, and the significant increase in the number of for our listeners, bums and seats is the equivalent of butts and seats here in the United States. At the significant operational expense and the investment in that kind of very specialized training. We're seeing the same kinds of things. I think you guys are further ahead in terms of actually having specialized queues, and all of the modeling and labeling and outsourced to specialized queues for managing that life cycle. But what I'm paying close attention to is where you guys, once again, you by the nature of this, going to be out in front, is what's going to help move to a more self-service model, in that in that process of determining intent. And I know there's a bunch of experimentation that I'm talking to both vendors and practitioners inside banks. How do we move from just adding more and more butts and seats and dealing with the kind of almost avalanche of operational expense and operational process and new policies and tools and all of those investments, to moving back to some kind of a self-serve capability?
And with the regulatory change coming in here in October, Lenny, around split reimbursement for fraud
Hmm.
between sender and receiver, banks are now monitoring inbound payments as well, which is going to create more alerts, which is creating a demand for more butts on seats, to use your terminology. I think there are things we
It's
can do.
butts.
I'm
It's
seeing.
butts in seats. Get it right.
I'm seeing similar things to you. I think there's some interesting use cases out there for things like AI, for the AI to have an intent-led conversation with the user, perhaps before they speak to an individual, so they can perhaps
Mm.
screen some of those more obvious ones out. If you train the AI in the right way, is it able to go and have those intent-type conversations? But I think you touched on an interesting point, and I want to flip this one back to you and get your US
Mm.
perspective on this. You talked about the labeling, not just labeling fraud or not fraud, not just labeling authorized or unauthorized fraud, not just labeling authorized, but then the particular type of scam that it was as well: romance, investment, impersonation, and so on. We touched right at the start, I guess, if we go full circle, that the UK has been very good at classifying that for a while. I noticed recently that the US have put out a Fed classifier. I'm just curious to your perspective of how's that landed in the market? How are the banks responding to that? Do you think this is the initial foundation to potentially enable the US to go and do something similar to what UK finance have done?
Uh, I really appreciate the question. And first and foremost, hats off and shout outs to all of the practitioners, fraud fighters, industry folks who worked really hard over the course of a couple of years to improve on on already the existing Fed classifier model, and Fed classifier framework, and to add the scam classification into it. I think they did a tremendous job of taking something very complicated and bringing it to both a simple form as well as something that can then be used by the industry. I think it's incredibly important, um, and because so much of our time is spent on having multiple folks across the organization that touch the fraud risk life cycle, even being able to speak the same language. Not to mention across institutions, across regulatory bodies, industry bodies, and so on. So, um, where what uh, uh, I'm seeing is a lot of detailed work by each and every kind of financial institution to look at how do they actually take advantage of it. How does it fit into their internal structures, into their tooling? What changes do they need to make in their tooling, and why? I think I feel like there's a pent up demand, and Dan, you and I are dealing with this with some of our customers for what are the best practices. Who's doing what, how, kind of workshopping things, understanding how to classify, getting down to the more detailed level from the kind of the first of all, even the basic classification between authorized and unauthorized, and then really being able to have value from differentiating the different scam types, at least at a broad level. So I think we're at the beginning of folks have heard me say this. We're at the beginning of a generational shift and a generational journey for how we handle this. And the classification, labeling, terminology, and the process by which we actually instrument that is really just getting off the ground for the majority of financial institutions here in the U.S. Some are further along, for sure. Um, it's a really important conversation. I don't expect us ever to get to any kind of uniformity, just given the scale and size, as well as the decentralized, by necessity, kind of structure of the United States. The United States, period, at kind of a population level, government level, and financial institution level. So we'll kind of use the microcosm of the UK as always, as we do, to understand trends, but apply it in our own way here.
Yeah, I understood, and I think some of the value add that's come from the application of that here is not just the reporting. That's the obvious, kind of immediate
Mm.
value that stands out, but just encouraging banks to label with more granularity has enabled more flexibility analytically when it comes to how you then
Yes.
fit your models, build your models, train your models, etc. So there's a whole other discussion around what's the right approach. Is it one model for all? Is it one model for ATO, one model for scams?
Well, let's get into it. What do you think?
So I think the way in which we see it most commonly applied is that you have one model to cover all fraud types. I think we're moving to a world where banks are experimenting with different approaches. There are also intricacies by the type and size of bank as well. So if you've got a bank that's multi-branded, for example, you often see brand one, brand two, brand three having their own different models. And that's really driven by the fact that the user journey is different or the customer demographic is different. Therefore, the risk type is different within those institutions. Whereas if you're a single one branded bank operating out of one country, then the single model seems to be the preferred way to go. When we've done experiments on this kind of stuff in the past, that opportunity to split of one model for certain type of ATO risk, one model to split for another type of scam risk, we do see some incremental gains, but they tend to be marginal rather than anything that's too overwhelming. So then the bank has to make a decision as to, do I say, all right, well, I'm going to have two models and take those incremental gains, but then you've got two models on which you have to do governance, maintenance, etc. on, so it perhaps increases some of the operational overheads in order to keep them both active within the production estate. So I think there's an argument for all of these different types of approaches. I think ultimately we yet to land on a one-size-fits-all approach, and I think a lot of it is going to be driven by the type of institution, the size of institution, etc. That you work in.
It's an interesting question. I think there's a lot of experimentation, innovation, and iteration that's required. My opinion, if I like, as a kind of going right into my thinking of the data, the actual logic, both the data science and models, as well as kind of strategies that overlay that, is that two differentiated models for authorized versus unauthorized is going to provide a lot of value, and I've already seen that at some of the, let's say, top largest institutions in the United States that are further out ahead in terms of their control structure, landscape, and tooling. So I really feel like if we even simply bifurcate on the basics of the customer doing it from a trusted device to a new or relatively new beneficiary versus the some activity that indicates clearly that there's a new device. It is.
I do wonder, Lenny, if that's, sorry to jump in. I do wonder if that's,
please.
I do wonder if that's to do with the volume of scams that are being observed and being reported in your region. So what I mean by that is, if we look at a typical UK bank, anywhere between 75 and 80% of the fraud that they now see is scam. Therefore, there isn't that much ATO fraud in which you can build a model if you're a medium-sized institution. So I wonder if that's one of the reasons that the one-size-fits-all approach has perhaps been a little bit more effective here. Whereas in the US, if you're closer to 50-50, then there's perhaps more of a legitimate opportunity to do that divorcing.
Oh, that's interesting. I think, by the way, we're maybe a year ago, from my conversations with colleagues, that folks were about 50-50. I think we're already at about 60-40 now with authorized and rising. That being said, you and I both know from our customers and kind of prospective customers we're talking to that just as we're trying to put our eye on scams and authorized, the unauthorized and ATO has really reared its head for several reasons, which we could go into that are fascinating. So I think there's going to be a significant value given the ability for be as agile as possible, as accurate and precise as possible, as well as, to the points you mentioned, to be able to manage the model governance and the rest of the process and policy governance required to have that kind of bifurcation. I think if to the extent where possible, I think it's going to lead to better results for some time to come.
Lenny, great conversation today. Unfortunately, we've hit time. Thanks very much to everybody that joined to listen. And we very much look forward to seeing you again at the next episode. Lenny, people can write in with questions, comments, if they wish to do so. What's the best way for them to do that?
We would love any of your comments, questions. If you want to call BS on anything that you heard, if you want to join the conversation and offer any of your thoughts, you can drop comments just directly on this post. You could reach either Dan or I via LinkedIn. And stay tuned, because we have a mind to do this live at some point in the near future and hopefully get you guys interact with us in real time. And that would be a lot of fun.
Indeed. Thanks again.